The check sat between them, unpolished, mahogany. $1 million, written in steady, elegant ink. Margaret Sterling's hand did not tremble. "Take it," she told the black man in the wrinkled flannel shirt, standing in her marble foyer. "Leave my daughter. Disappear quietly." Donovan Pierce did not reach for it. Genevieve stood frozen in the doorway, breath caught in her throat. Margaret smiled, the smile of someone who had bought silence many times before. She did not know the quiet man before her could buy the Sterling family 40 times over. What would you have done in that room? 3 weeks earlier, in a small Hudson Valley town called Beacon, in New York, dawn poured through the high windows of an old converted carriage house. The air smelled of beeswax, linseed oil, fresh varnish, and warm cedar shavings. Donovan Pierce stood at a worn cherry workbench, sleeves rolled to the elbow, fingers tracing the inlaid floral panel of an Edwardian cabinet that had survived 2 world wars and a long, careless decade in someone's damp basement. The veneer had cracked along its bottom seam years ago. He worked with the patience of a man who had spent more of his life listening than speaking, turning a small heated iron in steady arcs, lifting the warped grain back into its place with quiet, methodical hands. A small whirlwind in cotton pajamas burst through the side door. Imani, 7 years old, her hair a wild crown of natural curls tangled like a bird's nest, raced across the concrete floor in fuzzy yellow socks and stopped at his elbow with the gravest expression a child of 7 could manage. "Daddy," she announced, "today is picture day, and I need princess hair, the fancy kind. The kind I cannot do by myself." Donovan set the iron down. He looked at her, then at the tangled crown of dark curls, and a slow smile crept into the corners of his eyes. A smile only Imani was ever allowed to see in full. "Princess hair," he repeated. "That is well beyond my pay grade." "I know," Imani sighed, as if this were a tragedy she had been carrying for hours. "That is why we have to call her." He laughed low and quiet, pulled his phone from his back pocket, and sent a single message. 20 minutes later, the gravel drive crunched beneath the wheels of a silver Audi. Genevieve Sterling stepped out with a soft canvas tote and a paper cup of coffee in one hand. There was no driver. There was no entourage. There was no leather portfolio. In Beacon, at sunrise, before her first Monday meeting of the week, she was not the chief executive of anything. She was a woman who had agreed to braid a child's hair before school. Donovan met her at the door with a nod. He took her coffee for a moment as she shrugged off her coat, and his eyes lingered on her face the way they always did, quietly, without performance. Inside, Imani was already enthroned on the living room rug, surrounded by tiny ribbons. Genevieve folded down beside her without hesitation, crossed her legs like a teenager at a sleepover, and began to work the tangles out one strand at a time. Her fingers moved with surprising care for a woman who, in a few hours, would sign decisions affecting 2,000 employees. She parted the dark curls patiently, learning the texture as she went, and Imani chattered about the new girl in her class who had moved up from Atlanta. Donovan watched from the threshold, leaning one shoulder against the frame. He did not speak. There was nothing in him that needed to. When the braid was finished, a complicated woven crown that even Genevieve looked faintly proud of, Imani stood, twirled twice, and announced she was ready for the world. Genevieve gathered her tote. She kissed the crown of Imani's head, met Donovan's eyes for half a heartbeat, and walked out into the morning. Her sedan disappeared down the country road. No one on Wall Street knew that the woman who had just left a small carriage house in a Hudson Valley town would, by 10 o'clock, be sitting at the head of a long oak table on the 32nd floor of a glass tower, signing decisions that moved entire markets. Donovan drove Imani to school hand in hand, kissed her forehead at the kindergarten gate, and drove back along the river to the carriage house alone. Sterling Industries occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, the same building Genevieve's grandfather had broken ground on in 1968. From the boardroom on the 32nd story, the Hudson curved silver below the city, and the long oak table caught the light in a way that always made the room feel both elegant and slightly cold. Genevieve walked to the head of the table except Margaret Sterling was already there. Margaret had not held an executive title in nearly 2 years, since her husband's stroke had pushed Genevieve into the corner office, but she had quietly retained her board seat, and somehow she always managed to arrive first. Today she sat in the chair Genevieve had been using for the past 18 months, a small porcelain teacup in front of her, her hands folded with the patience of an older queen who had never quite agreed to be retired. Genevieve said nothing. She took the chair to her mother's right. Preston Vale stood at the head of the projector, the Sterling family attorney for the last 28 years. He had the polished, regretful voice of a man who could deliver any piece of news as if it were already someone else's idea. Today's news was the Hollister merger. Hollister Group has expressed serious interest in a friendly combination, he said, sliding through slides of synergies, market share, and projected efficiencies. Their offer protects shareholder value and accelerates our growth in the Northeast market by approximately 3 years. Genevieve listened. She had read the entire deck 3 times the night before, and something about it had kept her awake until 2 in the morning. On the 4th slide, she set her pen down. "Preston," she said quietly, "this revenue baseline runs about 4% below industry norms for our segment. Is that a typographical error, or are we reporting from a different source than last quarter?" Preston's smile did not change, but his eyes did. "An accounting harmonization, Genevieve. The auditors flagged a small reclassification last spring. Nothing material. We can walk through it offline." He moved to the next slide. Across the table, Naomi Fraser, the youngest independent director, kept her eyes on her notepad. She tapped her pen against the margin twice, a small, deliberate gesture. When Genevieve glanced at her, Naomi lifted her eyes for half a second. She did not speak. She did not have to. The two women understood each other in the way women on boards full of older men often did. After the meeting, Margaret caught Genevieve at the elevator. "Dinner tonight," she said. It was not a question. That evening at Beacon, after Imani had been read 3 storybooks and tucked beneath her comforter with her stuffed rabbit, Donovan walked into his study and closed the door without a sound. He laid one hand on the spine of a leather-bound volume of Whitman on the shelf behind his desk and pulled gently. The bookshelf swung inward on a silent hinge. A narrow staircase descended into a small plain room beneath the house. 3 monitors flickered on. Quiet streams of market data scrolled across them in pale green and amber. A single document was already open on the center screen. The title read, "Sterling Industries, Quarter-over-Quarter Deviation Analysis." He read the first page in silence, expression unchanged. He read the second more slowly. On the 3rd page, he reached for a pen and circled one specific figure with a single, even line in dark red ink. Then he closed the laptop, switched off the monitors, climbed back up the narrow stairs, slid the bookshelf back into place, and went upstairs to check that his daughter was still asleep. Her breathing was slow and steady. He smoothed the comforter at her shoulder, stood there for a long, full moment looking down at her, and did not say a single word out loud. Margaret's house in Greenwich, Connecticut, was older than the road that led to it. The dining room had been set for 2 with the silver Margaret had inherited from her own mother, the silver her own mother had inherited from hers, and on the mantel above the fireplace, a small carriage clock ticked with the patient confidence of a thing that had outlived several generations of opinions. Dinner began politely. The weather, the gala calendar, the renovation at the family chapel, and then, between the salad course and the main course, Margaret folded her napkin neatly in her lap. "Tell me about the man you have been seeing." Genevieve kept her face still. "I would rather not, Mother. He is a carpenter, isn't he? Lives out near the Hudson." Margaret lifted her wine glass and set it down without drinking. "African American. A single father. I only want to protect you, darling. That is my job. Even now, you do not know him at all. I know enough. There are worlds, Genevieve, that simply do not mix, no matter how hard people try. It is not a question of worth. It is a question of mathematics. You will be more lonely inside that world than you have ever been in this one. I have watched it happen to women far smarter than you and far younger." Genevieve set her fork down and did not eat the rest of the meal. The next morning, she drove out to Beacon early. She had not slept well at all. She found Donovan in the carriage house at the workbench, sleeves rolled, the Edwardian cabinet now standing on its own 4 feet against the wall. She set her leather folder on the bench almost without thinking, the quarterly board materials inside, and went into the small kitchenette to put a kettle on. When she came back out, 2 ceramic cups of black tea in her hands, Donovan was leaning over the open folder. He was not flipping pages. He was not reading. He was looking at a single line on the 3rd sheet. "This number," he said, without looking up. His finger tapped once on the page. "The revenue baseline. It runs about 4% below industry standard for your segment. Either someone moved the goalposts, or someone is taking a slice off the top before the rest of the company sees it. Deliberate or oversight." Genevieve set the cups down very slowly. It was the exact line that had kept her awake. She studied his face. He had read 3 pages of a quarterly board package in perhaps the time it took her to boil water. He had not paused. He had not used a calculator. He had used only his finger. Before she could speak, the side door banged open, and a small voice piped up from the doorway. Imani raced in with a tiny gift bag under her arm. "Miss Jenny," she announced, "I have Mia's birthday party next week, and I need a different braid this time. Bigger. Crown style." Genevieve smiled, in spite of herself. She lowered herself onto the braided rug beside Imani, took the small pink hairbrush the child held up to her, and began parting the thick curls with patient, even deliberate fingers. Imani chattered about the party guest list and the kind of cake she hoped there would be. Donovan leaned a shoulder quietly against the doorframe and watched them without saying a word in that quiet square of afternoon light. When Imani skipped off with her finished crown braid, Genevieve stood and turned slowly to face him. "Who are you, really?" Donovan met her eyes. He did not look away. "I am someone who will never lie to you," he said. "But some things have to come at the right time." She did not press. Not yet. She left without finishing her tea. The Sterling Foundation Gala was held every October at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. 300 guests, black tie, champagne towers, and a string quartet that could only be heard if the room briefly forgot to talk over it. To attend in the Sterling party was a small civic distinction. To be brought on the arm of the chief executive was another thing entirely. Donovan arrived in a dark navy suit, well cut but unremarkable, and a tie that was neither too narrow nor too wide. He kept his hands in his pockets, and his shoulders relaxed. His shoes had been polished once that morning, and once more in the car. He looked, to anyone glancing past, like a man who had thought a long time about not looking nervous. At the coat check, a woman in a fur stole turned at his approach and held out her coat without looking up. "Thank you, dear. Hang it carefully. The lining tears easily." Donovan took the coat from her hand, walked the 4 steps to the rack, slid it onto a velvet hanger himself, and handed the claim ticket to the real attendant without a word. The woman did not realize her mistake until she watched him fold his own claim ticket calmly into his pocket and walk away. Her cheeks went pink. Donovan did not look back. Genevieve met him at the marble staircase. She did not introduce him by name. She slid her hand inside his elbow and led him into the room. Margaret was waiting in the receiving line beside the chairman of the board. She greeted Donovan with a smile that was warm at the surface and made of glass underneath. "So," she said, just loud enough for the half circle around her to hear, "this must be the carpenter Genevieve has been mentioning to us. We are so glad you could come." The half circle smiled. 2 of the older women lifted their champagne flutes. Donovan inclined his head politely and said nothing at all. Tristan Hollister, the son of Roland Hollister, drifted up at exactly the right moment, with 2 flutes in his hands. He was 26, blonde, and rehearsed. "You must be the friend," he said brightly. The champagne tilted out of his glass and ran in a thin stream down the front of Donovan's jacket. "Oh," Tristan laughed, eyes wide with deliberate apology. "Sorry, I keep forgetting some fabric reacts differently to spills. It is just finer fabric than I am used to seeing on people I know." A small, polite laugh rippled through the half circle. Preston Vale, hovering behind Margaret, raised his glass with a thin smile and added, "Well, Perhaps Genevieve is broadening her education a little. There is something to be said for experiencing real life from time to time. The half-circle laughed again, slightly louder. Genevieve's face went hot. Her fingers tightened in the crook of Donovan's arm. She opened her mouth to say something cutting, something protective. Donovan very gently pressed her hand back down to his sleeve. He took the napkin a passing waiter offered him. He blotted the lapel of his jacket once, then folded the napkin into a neat square and handed it back. The room watched, then his eyes drifted past Tristan's shoulder. They settled on a small framed painting hanging beside the door, a study in muted reds and ochres, an interior with a half-open window. "A Bonnard," Donovan said quietly, almost to himself. "A reasonable reproduction, though the red stroke in the right corner is 2 shades off the original. The original is warmer, and the brushwork is looser." The half-circle blinked. Preston's smile froze for the smallest fraction of a second. Across the room, an older gentleman with silver hair and a small enamel pin on his lapel turned slowly in their direction. He narrowed his eyes at Donovan for a long moment, as if a name he had not heard in many years was rising slowly to the surface of his memory. He did not approach. He simply watched from where he stood. Genevieve felt the shift in the room and did not yet understand what any of it meant. The afternoon after the gala, Genevieve drove herself out to Beacon. There had been no fight between them the night before. No fight at all, in fact. But the silence in the car as she had driven Donovan back to his street had felt thicker than any argument she had ever had with anyone, and she had not been able to sleep through the night. She found him in the carriage house, sleeves rolled up to the elbow, the Edwardian cabinet propped on padded sawhorses. He looked up when she stepped inside, set his iron down, and dried his hands on a rag. "I am so sorry," she said before he could speak. He shook his head once. "Don't be. Not for that." For a long moment they stood across from each other in the warm sawdust-scented air. Then he gestured at the cabinet. "Edwardian, 1892, give or take. The joinery here is dovetail blind, mitered. A technique a young apprentice would have spent 2 years learning before being allowed to attempt it on a paying commission. Watch." He guided her around to the side panel. He pointed out the way the grain had been book-matched on either side of the central seam, the way the dovetails interlocked without a single visible seam, the subtle taper that allowed the drawer to close itself by gravity alone. He spoke not in the cadence of a man showing off, but in the cadence of someone explaining a small, beautiful thing he loved. Genevieve listened carefully. She watched his hands. She wondered again how a craftsman who lived in a converted carriage house had ended up so thoroughly in her life. The side door banged open. Imani raced in, a folded sheet of construction paper clutched against her chest. "Miss Jenny," she said breathlessly, "I had to bring you this. I made it at school today, in art class." Genevieve crouched down. Imani unfolded the paper carefully and held it up for her to see. 4 figures stood in a row of crayon. A tall brown stick figure with a beard, a small brown stick figure with curly hair, a taller stick figure with yellow hair, drawn in the middle, holding both their hands. Behind them, a small house with a slanted roof and a row of trees. "That is our family," Imani explained, very seriously. "Miss Heath said our family looks different from the other families. I told her families just look like the people who are in them, but then I drew it for her, so she could see what I meant." Genevieve's eyes burned. She reached out and gathered the child against her chest, the construction paper crinkling between them. She held Imani for a long moment without speaking, and when she lifted her head, she saw Donovan standing perfectly still in the doorway, watching them. There was something in the corner of his eye that she had never seen before. Not sadness exactly, a kind of very old tiredness. The tiredness of a man who had heard the phrase "your family looks different" in many forms over many years, and had decided long ago not to let his daughter see how much it cost him to keep hearing it. When Imani trotted back outside to draw with chalk on the walkway, Genevieve straightened slowly and turned to face him. "I want you to know something," she said. Her voice was steady and low. "I am not going to apologize for my mother again, because the apology belongs to her, not to me, but I am also not going to let her decide whose hand I get to hold in this lifetime." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Okay. She walked to the doorway. She paused there with her hand on the frame and turned back toward him. Who are you, really, Donovan? He held her gaze without flinching. Someone who will never lie to you. Ever. She studied him for another long beat, and then she stepped out into the late afternoon light, where Imani was already drawing a giant flower with a smiling face across 2 squares of the walk. The phone call came at 6:14 on Monday morning. Genevieve was already dressed, halfway through her second espresso, when her chief of staff's voice crackled through the speaker. Sterling is down 12% in pre-market trading. The Wall Street Journal is running a piece. A private fund has been quietly accumulating shares for months. Rumors of a hostile takeover. Genevieve set the espresso down on the counter. She did not finish it. By 8, the boardroom was full again. The Hudson, outside the windows, looked the same as it always did. Everything inside the room was different. Margaret had taken the chair at the head of the table once more, this time without any pretense of having merely stopped by. Preston Vale was already standing at the projector, slide deck loaded and ready. We need to act now, he said. Hollister Group has reiterated their offer in writing. A friendly combination is the only realistic shield we have. If we wait, the unknown fund will accumulate enough shares to dictate the terms entirely. We must vote today. We will not vote today, Genevieve said, her hands flat on the table. Preston, we still have no transparency on Hollister's actual leverage position. Their offer requires us to dilute existing common stock by an order of magnitude I have not seen justified anywhere in this deck of slides. Margaret cut in. Genevieve, darling, we do not have the luxury of being precious about details. The market is moving against us. That is exactly when details matter most, Genevieve said quietly. Margaret's smile flattened. We will move to a vote by Friday. That is the schedule. You are the chief executive officer. You are expected to lead, not to obstruct. Genevieve looked across the table. Naomi Fraser was staring at her notepad. Her jaw was tight. She did not look up. She could not yet afford to do so. The meeting ended without a vote. The room emptied slowly. Margaret laid a hand on her daughter's forearm before she left. Dinner tonight, she said. Bring him with you. Genevieve stared at her mother. What? The carpenter. I would like to meet him properly in our home. She smiled, and the smile was as warm as a stone left out in the snow. I think it is time, don't you? At 5 that afternoon, Genevieve drove out to Beacon. She found Donovan at his workbench, hands stained with stain. She told him what her mother had said. She did not tell him to come. Donovan set the rag down. He folded it once, then again into a neat square. He turned to face her. I will come, he said. She did not argue. She did not feel relieved either. Imani had a birthday party of her own to attend that afternoon. Her best friend's 7th birthday, at a small pottery studio in town. Donovan drove her there himself in the old pickup truck, walked her to the door, and crouched down to fasten the buckle on her jacket. She turned at the door, gift bag swinging in one hand, and waved with both. Come home early, Daddy, she said. I want to show you what I painted today. Donovan nodded. He did not promise. He never made promises he could not keep. When he walked back to the truck, Genevieve was waiting in her own car, parked at the curb. She had followed him. She had not been able to think of anything else to do. She rolled down the window. I will drive my own car, she said. Meet me at the gates. He looked at her for a long moment. He understood at once. 2 cars meant 2 separate paths home, if the evening went the way her mother clearly intended it to. He nodded once. They drove in 2 separate cars to the Sterling estate in Greenwich. The house rose at the end of a long curved drive lined with sugar maples turning the color of old copper. The windows were already lit from within. From a distance, it looked like a postcard. Up close, with the autumn wind moving in the high branches, it looked like something else entirely. Margaret received them in the front parlor. The room had been designed in the 1890s, restored by Genevieve's great-grandfather, and never updated except in small, invisible ways. A great chandelier of crystal teardrops hung over a Persian rug, the color of old wine. Oil paintings of forgotten Sterlings watched from gilt frames, Margaret wore the heavy gold chain her own mother had handed down to her on her wedding day. She gestured them to a low cluster of leather armchairs facing the marble fireplace, and she sat between them, not across from either, but slightly to the side, as if she alone were the audience of a play she had already written. A decanter of whiskey waited on a silver tray. She poured 2 fingers into a heavy cut-glass tumbler and set it in front of Donovan. He did not lift it. "Mr. Pierce," Margaret began. Her voice was warm, conversational, almost friendly in tone. "I am going to be direct with you, because I find directness to be a kindness in moments like this one. I do not think you are a bad man. I have made some inquiries about you. By all accounts, you are a quiet, hard-working, devoted father. That is admirable, truly." She lifted a leather portfolio from the table beside her. From inside, she drew a single rectangular slip of paper. She placed it gently on the polished mahogany between them. It was a personal check. The figure was written in her own steady, elegant handwriting. $1 million, payable to Donovan Pierce. "But you do not belong in this world, Mr. Pierce," Margaret said. Her voice did not change, and I want to be very clear with you about that. It is not my opinion. It is mathematics. My daughter does not yet see how this story ends. So I am asking you kindly to write the ending yourself. Take this. Go quietly. Do not return. $1 million is enough to put your daughter through any university in this country. With money left over for a house, that is the kindest gift I can give either of you today." Behind them, the heavy oak door opened. Genevieve stepped into the parlor. She had taken a wrong turn on the way back from the powder room. Her face went still in the way faces go still when the body has suddenly stopped breathing. Donovan did not turn around. He reached across the small table, picked up the check between his thumb and forefinger, and held it up under the chandelier, as if examining the watermark closely. He read every line. He read the date. He read his own name and Margaret's careful loop script. Then he stood. He walked, unhurried, to the marble fireplace and laid the check on the mantel beside the small brass clock that had been ticking quietly through the entire conversation. He turned back to Margaret. "I do not need it," he said. His voice was level and calm. "But I will leave it here. Very soon, you will need to remember writing it." Margaret's smile did not flicker on the surface. Underneath, something small and cold cracked. Donovan crossed the room in 5 long strides. He passed Genevieve at the doorway. He paused for half a heartbeat, not to speak, not to touch her, but only to acknowledge her, the way one boat passing another at night might briefly flash its lantern in salute. Then he was gone, down the marble hall, out the great front door, into the cold dusk. Genevieve stayed exactly where she was. She did not run after him. She turned very slowly to face her mother. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She looked at Margaret the way one looks at a stranger who has just sat down uninvited at one's family table. "You did not just insult him," she said. "You insulted me. And you did not even understand what you were doing." Margaret's hand reached for the check on the mantel. Genevieve shook her head once. "Leave it where it is." She walked out of the parlor without looking back. The brass clock kept ticking. The check stayed on the mantel. The drive back from her mother's house took Genevieve 38 minutes. She did not remember most of them. She remembered the headlights of an oncoming truck on a curve. She remembered a 4-way stop in the middle of nowhere. She remembered, more than anything, the way Donovan had paused at the doorway, the way he had not reached for her, the way that not reaching had felt like a hand, placed exactly where she needed one. She did not drive home. She drove to Beacon. It was a few minutes past 11 when she pulled into the gravel drive. The carriage house was dark. The main house had one warm window lit on the ground floor behind drawn linen curtains. She climbed the porch steps slowly. Before she could knock, the door opened. Imani stood there in pajamas printed with tiny moons, a half-finished coloring page in one hand, a blue crayon in the other. "Miss Jenny," she said, and launched herself forward and wrapped both arms around Genevieve's waist. "I knew you would come. I told Daddy. I told him." Genevieve's eyes pricked. She bent down and held the child for a long moment without speaking. Donovan appeared behind his daughter in the lamplight. He had changed out of his blazer into a plain Henley shirt, and his face was the same face she had seen in her mother's parlor. Calm, present, and slightly weary in a way she had never been allowed to see before. He sent Imani back to her coloring, with a quiet promise to tuck her in when she finished one more page. He led Genevieve down a short hallway, past the small library, to a built-in bookshelf that lined the back wall of his study. He placed his fingers on the spine of a leather-bound volume of Whitman and pulled. The bookshelf swung inward on a silent hinge. A narrow staircase descended into a small plain room beneath the house. 3 monitors filled one wall. 2 filing cabinets lined another. A long oak desk held a closed laptop, 3 legal pads, and a single black coffee mug. On the wall above the desk hung a single framed certificate, a Cayman registration document dated 9 years earlier. The name across the top read in plain serif type, Halcyon Capital Holdings Limited. Genevieve's knees went a little soft. She sat down without being asked. Donovan leaned against the edge of the desk, hands in his pockets. "I started it 12 years ago," he said, "out of a 1-bedroom apartment in Cambridge, while I was still finishing my doctorate at MIT. A small inheritance from my mother gave me the seed capital. We specialize in mid-cap companies that look healthy on paper but are bleeding from the inside, most often because someone on the board is bleeding them. We buy quietly. We audit. We restructure. We hand control back." Genevieve stared at the certificate. "And the unknown fund, the one accumulating sterling shares." "Halcyon." She closed her eyes. He went on gently. "I did not seek you out. I want you to know that. We crossed paths at an antiques auction in April. You were bidding on a Federal-era secretary desk. You do not remember. You did not even see me. Only later, when one of my analysts flagged Sterling Industries for accounting anomalies, did I realize that the woman I had been thinking about for 6 months was its chief executive. And you did not tell me." "No." "Why?" His eyes did not move from hers. "Because I needed to find out who was taking from you before I told you. And because, once I knew who I was, I needed to know whether you would choose me when I was no one." He reached into the desk drawer beside her knee and drew out a single folder, neatly tied with cotton string. "Everything is here." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning. By 8:30, the boardroom was already full. Margaret sat at the head of the table. Preston Vale stood beside her. The Hollister merger documents lay at every place setting. The whole room was tilted, structurally, in one direction. Genevieve walked in last. She did not take her seat. She remained standing, folder in hand. Preston opened. "We have a fiduciary obligation to act today. Delay invites the unknown fund to dictate the terms. I move that we vote." Genevieve's voice was steady. "We are waiting for a third party." Preston blinked. "We are not. The agenda has been, we are waiting for a third party." Margaret's hand tightened around her pen. At 8:59, the door at the far end of the boardroom opened. Donovan Pierce stepped inside in a charcoal suit, single-breasted, no tie. His shoes quiet against the parquet floor. 2 men in dark suits walked behind him. Older, calm. Wendell Aldrich, seated halfway down the table, set his coffee cup down, very gently. "Pierce," he murmured, audible only to himself and the man beside him. "Donovan Pierce. I suspected at the gala." Donovan did not look at him. He walked the length of the room, did not wait for an invitation, pulled out a chair at the far end, sat down, and laid a single folder on the wood. The room had gone perfectly still. "Halcyon Capital Holdings," he said, "acquired 26% of the common stock of Sterling Industries between June and last Thursday. Combined with the 5% held by Chief Executive Officer Genevieve Sterling, we now control 31% of the voting bloc. The Hollister vote will not be taking place this morning." Preston Vale stood. His face was the color of paper. "This is irregular." Donovan turned his head slowly. "Please sit down, Mr. Vale. Your portion will come shortly." Preston sat. Margaret's mouth had opened slightly. For perhaps the first time in her 63 years, she did not have a sentence prepared. The first slide came up behind Donovan, a corporate structure diagram, dense with shell companies. "This is Marbridge Holdings," he said, "registered in Delaware 7 years ago, reorganized through a Bermuda subsidiary 4 years ago. On paper, a consulting firm. In practice, an accounts receivable funnel. Over the past 3 years, Marbridge has issued 63 consulting invoices to Sterling Industries. Total payments, $47 million. There were no consultants. There were no deliverables. The contracts had been signed under the authority of the Office of General Counsel. The General Counsel was Mr. Vail. The wire transfers on the receiving end were countersigned by the same hand. The Hollister merger, as structured, would convert the chief executive's personal holding from 5% to less than 1%, and would issue a new preferred class of stock to Hollister's parent group, controlled through a family trust by Roland Hollister, who is the brother-in-law of Mr. Vail. This is not a merger. This is the closing transaction of a 3-year theft. Naomi Frazier put both hands over her face. Her shoulders began to shake. The ultimate beneficial owner of Marbridge, hidden behind a chain of nominee directorships in 2 countries, resolves at the bottom of the structure to a single individual. Margaret Sterling. The name landed in the room and did not move. Preston Vail rose. He took a step toward the side door. He took another step. The 2 men who had walked in behind Donovan rose. They were not advisors. They were investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission, and they had been waiting in the hall. Donovan turned at last to Margaret. He spoke as one might read a weather report. "You offered me $1 million to leave your daughter. You took $47 million from her without ever asking." Margaret sat down slowly. The chair beneath her made a small wooden creak. Genevieve walked the length of the table. She stopped beside her mother's chair. She did not speak. She simply looked down at her, not in fury, not in triumph, but with a long, quiet sorrow. Then she turned and walked out of the boardroom. 3 weeks passed. Sterling Industries did not collapse. The stock bottomed out on a Thursday, climbed 12% on Friday, and by the following Wednesday had risen above where it began. Halcyon Capital Holdings disclosed itself and remained a passive long-term shareholder. Preston Vail was indicted on 12 federal counts. Margaret Sterling was not indicted. Genevieve had negotiated a private restitution, returning the stolen funds over 3 years in exchange for her mother's resignation from public life. Margaret signed the papers at her own dining table with no witnesses except her daughter. They did not embrace or speak. On a Sunday morning in early November, the small house in Beacon smelled of butter and maple. The light through the kitchen windows was pale. Imani stood barefoot on a wooden step stool at the counter, her hair in a loose braid, her hands dusted to the wrists with pancake flour. Donovan stood beside her at the stove, sleeves rolled, a spatula in one hand, watching the batter set in the pan. The screen door creaked. Genevieve walked in. Her hair was still tangled from sleep. She wore an old cream sweater, a size too large. She had a paper bag of pastries under one arm, and the look of a woman who had finally remembered how to wake up slowly. "Miss Jenny." Imani turned on the step stool. Flour drifted off her elbows. "Look, Daddy and I are making one with a face on it just for you. It is going to have blueberry eyes and a banana smile and everything." Genevieve laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and bent to kiss the top of the child's head. She set the pastry bag on the counter and began, without being asked, to wash the strawberries in the sink. After breakfast, they carried mugs of coffee out to the back porch. The maples along the Hudson had turned the color of brushed copper. The air smelled of wood smoke. Imani had taken her stuffed rabbit to the front lawn and was conducting an important wedding for it. Donovan and Genevieve sat on the wooden step. For a long while, neither spoke. The porch boards were warm beneath them where the sun reached. "Why didn't you tell me?" Genevieve asked finally. Her voice was quiet. There was no accusation in it. There was only the last small piece of a question that had been sitting between them. Donovan looked out across the yard. "Because I needed to know," he said, "if you would choose me when I was no one." Genevieve did not answer. She reached over slowly and slid her hand into his. Their fingers folded together on the warm wood between them, and the river kept moving beyond the trees. Inside the house, in the small study behind the bookshelf, the $1 million check remained folded in Donovan's desk drawer. He had never cashed it. He had never torn it. It would stay there as a quiet reminder of how close two people had once come to losing each other before they had begun. Neither of them had been looking, but she had found him first, back when he was no one to anyone but himself, and that was the only version of him she would ever need.